Hello, fellow book lovers, and welcome back to Colin's Corner. Firstly, I want to take a minute here at the beginning of this video just to say thank you guys so much for all the support on my first video, my channel introduction, which I will link above if you haven't watched that yet. The support you guys showed me and the love for the channel and the comment section, it far exceeded anything that I could have anticipated. So again, from the bottom of my heart, I just want to say thank you guys so much for showing love to the channel. Now, in keeping with the theme from that video of getting to know me better, today we are going to talk about my top 6 most influential reads. Now, I want to preface this video by just saying that I'm going to keep the discussion generally pretty spoiler free about these and just kind of talk about how these books influenced me as a reader. So these 6 books or series of books were integral pieces to me becoming the reader that I am today. There are no specific ranking. The only real structure here is going to be that they're pretty much in chronological order in terms of when I read them in my life. So without anything further, let's get right into it. So my first influential read is going to be Calvin and Hobbes by Bill Watterson. Now, this was actually a newspaper comic strip that released from 1985 to 1995, but that isn't how I consumed this. I remember my mom coming home one day. She had bought me this huge rectangular floppy compilation of all the Calvin and Hobbes comics, and I pored over this thing for weeks this one summer, and I lived in this little world with Calvin and Hobbes. Now, for those of you that don't know, Calvin is a 6-year-old boy who goes on adventures with his stuffed tiger, Hobbes. And they're just so endearing. And I remember, what stuck out the most to me about Calvin and Hobbes was how I laughed, how I got to experience sadness. And I really felt like I was just along for the journey with these two. It was funny because Hobbes appeared as just a stuffed animal to anybody else other than Calvin, but when Calvin was with him, he spoke with them and he went on these crazy adventures and to all these different fantastical worlds. It was funny, it was endearing, and it really gripped me. 2 things, obviously, about comics that are super important are the writing and the illustrations. And the illustrations paired with Watterson's writing were just amazing, and they still hold up today. I ran through just a few strips in preparation for this video because it's been so long since I've read them. And there's a lot more social commentary. There's deeper themes than I was picking up on as a kid. But, what I remember the most is how fun this comic strip was for me to read. So, with my first entry, my most influential reads, we have Calvin and Hobbes. My second influential read is going to be To Kill a Mockingbird by Harper Lee. Now, I know this book is banned in many places, but it wasn't when I read it. And, following Scout from that crucial time when she's 6 to 9 years old, when she's learning to grow up, it really stuck with me. This is the first book that I remember making me feel uncomfortable because of its simple yet pointed look at prejudice and racism. And, what this book did for me was it showed me how important literature is in allowing us to explore these topics that are a little bit uncomfortable but still necessary to talk about. I believe To Kill a Mockingbird was based on true events that Harper Lee experienced in her small town, but it takes place in a fictional town of Macomb in the South during the Great Depression. And it was sad but realistic to see how quickly Scout had to grow up in this book. And, this book made me realize that my sheltered childhood in the early 2000s, late 1900s, early 2000s, is not how every child lives. And so it really opened my eyes. It was kind of a slap in the face that I needed to think about others in a different way and what they might be going through and how to treat others and what treating somebody poorly does to the receiving party of that. So with my second entry, we have To Kill a Mockingbird. Next up for number 3, we have A Series of Unfortunate Events by Daniel Handler, or better known by his pseudonym, Lemony Snicket. This was the first book series that I thoroughly remember being addicted to. I'm talking about having all the books lined up on my shelf and making sure the spine's lined up and looking at the covers of the next book and seeing the pictures and wondering how the heck the characters are going to get out of this one. How did they even get into it in the first place? And for those of you that don't know, the series of unfortunate events follows three siblings, the Baudelaire siblings, Violet, Klaus, and Sunny. Their parents and their mansion, unfortunately and devastatingly, perished in a fire. And so they were tossed into foster care, which started their series of unfortunate events where throughout the 13-book series, they are trying to evade the evil clutches of Count Olaf, who is after their fortune. Now, this story was a story of perseverance. It was a story of togetherness. It was a story of journeys. It was a story about creativity and collaboration between the siblings and having faith. It touched on so many things that are still important in life today. One of the things that stuck out to me the most about a series of unfortunate events is the humor. In the openings of chapters, Lemony Snicket would go on these wild, rambling, just tangents, and you read it and you're sitting there thinking, how in the heck does this have anything to do with the story? And the next thing you know, he ties it right into exactly where the Baudelaire orphans were, or where you left them off. And it was so funny, and the humor in the opening chapters. Sunny, she only speaks in gibberish, but her siblings can translate everything that she says. That was so much fun. This was the first book that I read that had a rather large cast of characters, so that was exciting for me to follow all of the different villains and all the different members of Count Olaf's cohort. And I really related with Klaus as a character. He loved to read. He also loved to research, which isn't necessarily my favorite thing, but the reading part, I definitely could relate to. This series constantly had me wondering if they were going to get out of the situation. It was the first series that made me worried that my protagonist wasn't going to make it. And that was scary at the time, but really cool, and it kept me drawn into the series. And just a side note, we as a family just finished reading aloud to each other the entire 13-book series, and it was so wonderful to go back and live in this world with the Baudelaires again and experience all of their crazy adventures with my daughter and my wife. So for number 3, we have a series of unfortunate events. Number 4, it's going to be an obvious one. It's the Harry Potter series. This series was being published at the perfect time for me. It was the first truly fantastical world that I experienced through books, with magic and wizards and trolls and witches and mystical creatures. And it was also the first story that I read with a really big baddie, the magnitude of Voldemort. And so not only was I worried about my protagonists being safe, but I was worried about how this was going to affect the world. And, that was super cool to just worry about the entire wizarding and muggle world as I was reading through this series. Again, this is another really great story about perseverance, about found family, about fighting against all odds, about an unlikely hero, and everyone knows what Harry Potter's about. But to me, this series holds a special place in my heart because I remember we had this little 1978 Coleman trailer, and we would go in summers to this campground, and I would bring these, huge books at the time for me to this campground with me, and I'd be reading in these little corners of the trailer or out in a camp chair by the fire, and I had all these beat up copies with the covers torn off and pencil markings and who knows what kind of stains on them, but I loved them. They were well-loved books and well-loved stories. Funny thing, I never finished the series as it was coming out. I just revisited it. We read the first 3 books as a family. Kind of took a brief hiatus on Goblet of Fire because it kind of gets a little bit more serious, but it takes a little while to get into the story. So my daughter was kind of losing interest, but we are going to come back to it. But I did finish the rest of the 4 books after The Prisoner of Azkaban through audio, narrated by Jim Dale, and it was great. The story still holds up for me. It will be something that I hopefully pass down to my daughter and that she will love. And obviously the movies are great. But yeah, for number 4, we have Harry Potter. Moving on to number 5, we have 11/22/63 by none other than Stephen King. This was the book that brought me back to reading fiction as an adult. I bought it on a whim at the beach in a bookstore. I had never read any Stephen King before, and I don't know why I picked it, but I did. And I was completely hooked from the very beginning. I was so invested in this story, which is Jake Epping, this English teacher that has the potential to change the course of history. And, it was so fun for me to get back into reading that I was addicted to this book. As somebody that wasn't currently reading as an adult, I finished this 800 plus page book in the span of about 2 weeks. So, I couldn't put this thing down. 11/22/63 also started my foray into BookTube. I wanted more. I wanted more books like this. I wanted more Stephen King books. I wanted to talk about it. I wanted to find a place where I could express my feelings and thoughts on what was going on in the book and what happened in the book and how it ended and where it was going and all these different things. So I started searching on YouTube, and it led me to all these different communities that I'm in today, and it essentially led me to here, where I'm at. And I now have an entire bookshelf dedicated to Stephen King. I collect his books. So this book really brought me back to enjoying literature as an adult. It's something that I will never forget and I will never take for granted. It's still to this day one of my top probably 4 or 5 Stephen King books. And I've read, about 30 now. So it's a fantastic story, and it means a lot to me personally. So with number 5, we have 11/22/63 by Stephen King. And last, but certainly not least, we have a couple of books that need absolutely no introduction. It's going to be The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings by J.R.R. Tolkien. I obviously don't need to talk too much about this. If you don't know the story of Lord of the Rings now, it's been out for over 80 years. What I do want to say about this series is that I read through The Hobbit the first time in high school, and I loved it. But recently, last year, I read through The Hobbit and the main series immersively. So I read along with the audiobook narration by Andy Serkis. And if you haven't done that or tried that, I highly, highly recommend it. It made this experience so much fun for me. So I'm briefly just going to talk about The Hobbit. Like I said, I read it for the first time in high school, and I got a sense from the very beginning of that book that I was just dipping my toes into an extremely vast and sprawling world that was created by Tolkien. Middle-earth felt so real, yet was the most magical place I've ever experienced at the same time. And for The Hobbit, I'm trying to delicately time reading this one to my daughter because I want her to experience this magical journey like I did, so that we can read and talk about them someday. Believe it or not, last year I just finished The Return of the King in January. It's the first read through I've ever done of the main series, and it absolutely blew my mind. I think the reason that I put this one off for so long was because I knew that I could only experience it for the first time once. And, that's kind of sad, but it was also absolutely amazing to go through this journey, this pinnacle story of found family, friendship, journeying to almost certain death. This series definitely sparked my interest in adult fantasy and exploring people that were influenced by Tolkien, who, are innumerable at this point. This series really sparked my interest also in creating a channel because it lends itself to be talked about and discussed. I needed more. I wanted more. And I know that, reading through the main series is really just the beginning of Tolkien's world. So I can't wait to dig backwards, dig sideways, dig up, down, however I can to learn more about this and the lore of this world and the magic of Middle-earth. So to round it out with number 6, we have The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings. So that wraps up today's video of my top 6 most influential reads. Let me know in the comments what your guys' most influential reads were, and we can talk about them. I want to thank everybody who checked this video out today. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Also, my Twitter for the channel is listed down below. That's the best way to get a hold of me and the best way to keep track of what I'm up to and what the channel is up to. And remember, you're always welcome in Colin's Corner.